but you destroy the harm principle, because if you say this hurt me and psychological harms are as real as physical harms, then the old harm principle, which works on the idea that as long you can do whatever you like, as long as you don't harm others, as soon as you make broaden the concept of harm, you engage in concept creep, then it becomes impossible to defend speech using John Stuart Mill's harm principle and the sort of various intellectual traditions that emerged in the UK going back to the Civil War and parliamentarianism and the Levellers and so on and so forth.
Hi, Culminators. We're going to a far distant land today. A land that has become a lot more distant than I ever think I thought it would become in certain respects, besides being at the antipode and the opposite end of the world from where we are now. That's Australia. And we're going to talk to Helen Dale, the very interesting, very eclectic, and not entirely uncontroversial writer who you can find at Helen Dale. I just love her subtitle, Not on Your Team, but Always Fair. I wish I'd thought of that.
That's also the name of my Substack as well. I didn't put But Always Fair in it because it would have made the string too long to type into the search bar.
You mean on the Substack?
But the Substack is
Yeah.
just www.notonyourteam.co.uk. Do be aware that whilst my initial claim to fame was in Australia as a novelist, I don't live there anymore and haven't done so since the end of 2016. I live in the UK now, which is why it's daylight. It's why it's daylight here.
Yes, and you've also so you left Australia just about the time it began becoming benighted, a little bit before. Well,
I've come back and forth. But my last visit to Australia was in 2018, and it was actually for the second Kingdom of the Wicked novel, which is my third novel overall. And it was the author tour for that to Australia in 2018 because of COVID and also decisions of mine. I can't just blame COVID, decisions of mine. I'd not gone back, and I'm going back this year for the whole of October for a number of conferences and events with Australian think tanks and organisations.
So, Helen, you start out as a writer, correct?
Yes.
And you broke onto the scene with this Ukrainian novel that perhaps there were mixed signals.
That was the one that was the enormous bestseller.
The enormous bestseller
in Australia.
Which
and it won the Mars Franklin, which is the Australian equivalent of the Pulitzer.
And you got into a little bit of controversy there over whether it was true fiction.
I had a run-in, and we can talk about this if you like, because it's now become a global phenomenon.
I think we should.
But I had a run-in with the Jewish lobby, and they used to fight their battles in a more peaceful way. They were never violent, but in every other respect, the way the wokies do. So it would be letters to...
Well, a lot of them are the same people.
And that's what, letters to your employer. It would be
really
letters to your university. Very unpleasant letters to me.
And this was over the content of the novel?
Yes, it was. It was... Basically, it works like a diptych. So this is historical fiction, not science fiction, by the way. There is no science fiction in this first book. I need to assure people of that. Please don't get...
It's complicated enough.
Yeah. It's a diptych where basically half of the book is set in the Holodomor and half of it is set in the Holocaust. And I use the attitudes of the people from the period. So there are a significant number of Ukrainian collaborators in it, and with the Nazis, and their motivations for doing what they are doing took bad things to Jews, but not only to Jews, Poles and stuff as well.
And certainly not to the Jews who caused who had any involvement in causing the Holodomor. I mean,
Well, Stalin was very good at spiriting people away. And I found when I researched the novel that there was still bitterness in Ukraine that Stalin had succeeded in getting rid of, spiriting Lazar Kaganovich out of Kiev, because he was the sort of focal point of the hatred
he was an incredible mass murderer, and people, if it weren't for Stalin,
in Ukraine.
yeah, people don't appreciate. I mean, he's such a minor character in people's understanding, like impressionistic understanding of the Bolsheviks. You think, okay, Stalin, Trotsky, Bukharin,
Lenin, Beria,
right,
these
you
are the
go through
names
those
that if you
names.
pay attention to that history,
Molotov is where
yes.
already people start getting more sophisticated. No one gets to Kaganovich, who was amazingly one of the few Jews to outlive Stalin in the top communist leadership, but who was an absolute butcher, an absolute son of a bitch, and unapologetic to his last moments on earth.
Well, this is the thing. I was actually in Ukraine when he died.
Oh man.
Okay, and this is how I got this palpable sense of from people that he was never brought to justice, and the equivalent, including in terms of the numbers of dead. The other thing was, of course, is to Ukrainians, he's like Eichmann is to Israelis. There is a very, very similar sort of view in the history, and
Well,
for
not
exactly the
just
reasons you
Israelis,
say.
Jews and I mean that's one of the examples where you should say Jews and not Israelis. The Israelis were the ones who took care of him, but he wasn't killing
Yeah,
Israelis; he was killing Jews.
but I mean, in terms of this is something that just crystallized a huge moment in an entire country's history.
But this was after your book had been written.
Kaganovich died actually in the 90s. So,
Right. Oh, no, right. Okay, of course.
So this is, I was doing the research for it. So this is why this point constantly
Wasn't he the
came
one
up. But
who croaked right? Just like,
yes,
like his last words were,
when the news
yeah.
first came out, I thought he had been killed. When I
Ah,
first heard news, from Ukrainians gabbling to each other, and I was
over the fall.
learning the language.
You and
So
I are understanding
I
each other, but the
thought,
listeners
oh
are not.
gosh, this is
During the fall of the Soviet Union.
I thought this is going to turn into Romania. This is not going to be nice and peaceful like Poland or East Germany. There's going to be violence, and there wasn't. But
Although,
that's what I thought at the time.
which many say now was not that there should have been violence or, uncontrolled retribution, but that there's never was really any sort of coming to terms, with a reckoning for people who had been involved in inhuman crimes against humanity that the Soviet Union
Well,
had
yes,
been.
communism was and Marxism has never been held to account. There was no judgment at Nuremberg. There was no Eichmann trial. I mean, there were a few little attempts in what had been East Germany to get some Stasi people. There were a few attempts in Ukraine, few attempts in the Baltic countries, but it all fizzled, and you had very, very old people. And this is when in West Germany, when because they were so old, when they were trying some of the old Nazis, they were all getting suspended sentences because they were all ancient. And you had some Stasi commander who was the same thing. They were getting suspended sentences because it's very difficult to send. As soon as you start having a functioning legal system, it's very difficult to send someone who's older than 70 years of age to jail. People just won't do it.
Well, we'll see about that in the United States.
Oh, they're going to try and send Trump to jail.
I,
I'm sorry, I won't say anything other than that little oh god about
yeah, no,
American
well,
politics because I'm not American, and I'll shut
all right.
up.
So I'm sorry for all the interruptions. Back to the diptych. So you were doing so. I imagine right off the bat, these professional Holocaust people who have made the
This
Holocaust.
I was not allowed to compare.
Right.
That was the first thing. Thou
Obvious.
shalt not compare. That the next thing was you're blaming us, which came from two directions, but only the Jewish one was public because Ukrainians were just less prominent in the arts and culture. But I heard about this privately. Was the mutual blame game? Oh, we collaborated with Hitler because you lot were all commies, and we were all commies because you lot had pogroms on us.
All right. I mean,
Back and forth continuously.
both
It was very, very unpleasant to be in the middle of.
and both premised on this savage concept of group guilt.
Yes.
Which,
Oh,
which
you must understand this in every possible sense of this idea of group blame, group guilt, group responsibility, and also this is something that is we need to be aware of, that's become a big part of culture, but it was pervasive amongst these two groups when I was writing the book. It became really, really clear to me, is holding someone account, an individual account, to account, often in a pretty destructive way, like confiscating their property and so on and so forth, or worse. But we'll start with confiscating the property because they both started like this and then it became worse. Holding someone to account for something that their ancestors did.
underlies the
And
Palestine-Israel
yes,
business.
and the thing is, with the ancestors, you would get, I mean, sometimes a rich historical memory is not necessarily a good thing. You would have people who are bitter and twisted about things that went back to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, to the
Sure.
Khmelnytsky
Oh,
massacres, to
sure. Sure.
earlier than that.
Yep.
You know, there were people who had this rich and detailed tapestry of knowledge about some extraordinary incident that was probably true, or at least partly true, 500 years earlier. That kind of thing. And I just thought, this is the kind of thing that has to go in the ground. You know, it's like your debts.
And so,
Once if they can't be satisfied from your estate, then that's too bad.
yeah,
You don't go after the kids.
in other words, not this whole concept of reparations.
Yes, you just can't have it.
There's no end
You
to it.
will turn your country into the Balkans
And,
or Ukraine.
and also, I mean, it's so irrational and illogical. Let's go to Europe. Which are we going to go to Rome and seek reparations on behalf of the Visigoths, or the Visigoths on behalf of reparations on behalf of the sacking of Rome? Like, this is his human history. Okay, this is far beyond you and I.
Mm.
Solzhenitsyn also
So
got
I mean,
in.
so that was my first introduction to all of this kind of thing. And it was very controversial, but in those days when people attempted to cancel you, it was much, much harder. They could get you.
2016,
No, this is 1995 was when I won the Miles Franklin
95.
Award
That,
for the
oh,
hand that
okay.
signed.
Mhm.
Okay, for the hand that signed the paper for this one that which is the Holodomor Holocaust setting one that I'm
Right.
talking about.
But
Uh,
and your task there was to really contextualize. You were not denying the Holocaust. You were
Oh
not
God, no.
minimizing the Holocaust.
Oh no, it was absolutely essential to the story. I mean, this kind of thing.
I mean,
But it was to do with people wanting to control how they are portrayed. And which is the problem for me was not started by me or even any of my critics. We had lowered the drawbridge to this idea that you can punish an artist for the way people respond to their art form. And that had happened with Rushdie. And my very good friend, Professor Katie Barnett at the University of Melbourne, has maintained consistently, and I don't mind quoting her, that this all started with Salman Rushdie. And because the world did not have his back then, it has made it progressively more difficult to defend free speech and just expressive rights in the
you
arts more
think
widely.
you think the reaction to the Salman Rushdie fatwa was overall a failure on the West's part?
In what sense? On the West's part, yes, because we didn't defend the principle.
We
I
did.
mean, a lot of people didn't like Rushdie. They thought he was a this, that, and the other. And that's why you hear if you read Joseph Anton, and I realize that a big memoir about his time in hiding while he's being protected by Special Branch, he's going to be quite bitter about people who didn't have his back. But some of the stuff in there from people who really should know better, who are scions of the literary establishment in the UK and the US. Oh, yeah, well, maybe it would be good if Salman Rushdie learnt better manners and stopped biting the hand that feeds him and this kind of thing.
Do you think that this failure on the Rushdie thing was specific to the personalities and this beginning of Western liberal or left wing, let's say, comfort with the Islamic Revolution, or what do you think that was about?
No, I don't think that was the case then. And I mean, you do see these stupid left alliances because they think it's all in the name of liberation,
Right, it's all about the
and
revolution. Sure.
and they're completely unaware of the Iranian history where the Islamists turned on all the secularists and the Marxists and just killed them all, imprisoned them all, vast slaughter. They're completely unaware of that history and that it would happen again. An example, so you get this weird alliance between Queers for Palestine and Hamas, and where Queers for Palestine actually in Gaza, they would be the same as the secularists in Iran in 1979. They would all have their throats cut. So you do see these very weird left alliances, but I don't think that was happening in 1989 with the Satanic Verses.
So
I think what
yeah,
was
yeah.
happening there was we had already lost our nerve in terms of protecting a writer's expression rights and the quality of his, and also the text, the quality of the work that he'd produced. We'd already lost our nerve because already there had been a number of years in the universities where the old thing that if someone or a writer said something nasty about you or your group, you just had to get over it because it was just words. There'd been a reversal of that, probably because some of the things that were actually said about minority groups and women in the past were very, very nasty. But the point is, we lost that distinction between words and deeds.
But in the U.S., around the same time, there had, in the 80s, there had been these multiple instances of scandalous artistic expressions. I mean, they're not really art, but what had become to be accepted as sort of art, and famously the Piss Christ installation. In other words, attacks on Christianity and or the attacks on Jerry Falwell by Hustler magazine. Those
Oh yes,
so in
yes.
those cases, the Penn, and the fraternity of writers and free speech, fetishists, like such as myself. I mean, I was in college then, but the traditional response was in place, but here,
And from, to be fair with
yeah,
Penn, with Rushdie, it was in
it
place
was, yeah,
there too. Penn were good,
Penn was good.
and this very much started. First, it was just beginning to leak out of the universities, this idea that if you portrayed someone negatively and it hurt their feelings, then that was your fault as the writer. If you'd done that, you needed to mind your P's and Q's. And of course, it was based, the logic of it was based on this idea that what's offensive is very subjective, and what's people considered nasty is very subjective. So you get this what's happened in Britain with this perception-based policing. It's literally offensiveness or victimization or racism in the eyes of the beholder.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so it's just in the terms of their perception. But the problem with it is, if you say it hurts me, you destroy the harm principle, which in Britain is the core of our free speech history, because we don't have a written constitution. It's just lots of collections of post-it notes. It's not
I'm going to
actually
remember
in a
that.
single document.
That's how I'm going to explain it.
It's a good way.
Yeah.
It's just many, many thousands of post-it notes developed over thousands of years. So that kind of makes sense. But you destroy the harm principle, because if you say this hurt me, and psychological harms are as real as physical harms, then the old harm principle, which works on the idea that as long you can do whatever you like, as long as you don't harm others, as soon as you make broaden the concept of harm, you engage in concept creep, then it becomes impossible to defend speech using John Stuart Mill's harm principle and the sort of various intellectual traditions that emerged in the UK going back to the Civil War and parliamentarianism and the Levellers and so on and so forth.
So, in contradistinction to the famous Skokie Nazis decision, where the Supreme Court said, yeah, though they're going to hurt a lot of people very profoundly because Skokie's full of older Jews. This is in the early 80s, who are survivors or the children of survivors of concentration camps. So for neo-Nazis to there's going to be harm. We're talking about emotional harm, but that's very real. It doesn't matter because the First Amendment, that was the high point. Not from the Supreme Court, which has been consistent since then, but that was the high point. That was pretty much the end of the line for the ACLU and the so-called civil libertarians in the U.S. to take a neutral stance on free expression, regardless of whose free expression it was.
I mean, it became a scene in the Blues Brothers. I hate
Illinois
Illinois
Nazis.
Nazis.
And
I'm sorry, this is the way it's come down to people outside the US.
right.
It's become a scene in the Blues Brothers.
Another third rail that you stepped on was interviewing David Irving.
Oh, yes, I did that. And weirdly, I did it for a fashion magazine that I don't think exists anymore, probably because it paid its writers obscenely well. It was and it was mainly photographers, very fancy photo shoot. Well, I can explain.
And was this before or
With
after
David
his conviction?
Before, well, no, he wasn't convicted. It was
Oh, it was a
we don't
civil.
have criminal.
It was
a civil it
no.
was
Didn't
a
he end up
libel
spending
case.
some time in prison for Holocaust?
In Austria for
Austria.
Holocaust denial.
Right. Okay.
In Austria for Holocaust for denial, and because that is criminal speech in a lot of European countries, Austria, Germany, and I suspect quite a few of the others as well. It's very, very common to have Holocaust denial criminalized on the continent.
When you spoke to him, it was when everyone pretty much began. By the 80s, people were kind of onto him, but he was.
Well, oh goodness, when did this happen? He very foolishly, and I remember writing this at the time because I wrote articles about it in the Australian press. He got this idea in his head that he wasn't a Holocaust denier, despite saying obvious Holocaust denial things. So therefore, he sued Deborah Lipstadt, and I think a couple of other people, but mainly Deborah Lipstadt, for calling him a Holocaust denier. And the thing is, it was just the stupidest. I sat there and covered great chunks of this trial and then interviewed the guy. And I said, but you've said all these things that is obvious Holocaust denial. And so it became clear during the course of the trial that what he wanted to do was get the other side to drag out their evidence so he could just sit there and poke holes in it. You know, the whole thing was just performative.
Do you remember?
And the thing is, that's all very entertaining to do something performative like that.
Right.
But, and here's the thing that you will get this as a lawyer. The lawyer will notice this. He hadn't made any attempt to make himself writ-proof. He owned free and clear a property in Grosvenor Square.
Writ-proof. So in the US, we would call that judgment proof. Yeah.
Judgment proof. Yes. Okay. Basically, so all of this money, and because he'd been very economically successful when he was younger, best-selling books and all of this kind of thing, and carefully invested, so not a fool. And it was all still in his name. And of course, he lost completely, comprehensively, and was bankrupted.
Wow.
Because libel is a rich man's tort.
Yeah.
And all of that property was sold out from underneath him.
Thereby, and which I imagine subsequently, I'm not a psychologist, but like everyone else, everyone likes to dabble, made him all the more resentful. And look, this is what they've done to me. I'm only asking questions. And
I'm sure it did, but I interviewed him when he was still, I visited his house in Grosvenor Square, the very fancy one.
Yeah, Grosvenor Square, ladies and gentlemen, that's like living on the Gold Coast in Chicago, or or Park Avenue in in New York.
So I interviewed him there, and the photographer from the fashion magazine was doing all these fancy photographs and so on and so forth. And it just became clear to me, he's extremely clever.
Oh, yeah.
And he's just got this thing in he's got a brainworm, basically, an obsessive brainworm. And I honestly thought, with after interviewing him and covering the trial, I honestly thought, I will never meet another person like that.
I'm sure.
I will never meet someone so obsessed with one thing, with Jew, and it was with Jews, not with just the Holocaust, with Jews, full stop. I will never meet someone so obsessed about one issue group of people ever again. And I was proven wrong, because I have since now met several, not huge numbers, but then these aren't the circles I move in, of people on the political left who have the same kind of obsession that David Irving had about Jews, but they have it about Israel.
But they have it about Israel.
Obsessed. They
But
have it about
but
Israel. They are obsessed. Like this is the socio-political equivalent of someone who lines up all their Lego on the in height order on the windowsill, or or has all the Star Wars figurines, the original ones from the 70s and 80s, on a little cloth dais that rotates. Or this is what it was a wonderful thing to do as a child, and so on and so forth. But you need to stop it. You really do.
weird.
Just,
Wow.
but yes, so I don't know how common that is, because I'm not an academic. I don't know large numbers of university student children, teenagers, but I know a few people through politics, because I have been in that sort of Westminster bubble village. I covered Brexit for the Australian, that kind of thing. I have encountered a few of them, and it's like other conflicts don't even exist. So you can't even trip them up with, well, what about Sudan? Terrible conflict going on there at the moment. Or what about Burma? Conflict going on there. Or the
In other words,
Uyghurs
if
or
you're so
whatever.
concerned about genocide, why is it only
Yes, yeah. Why
because
you can't get
even
anywhere,
using
because
that
you just
term?
get this
Yeah.
blank. And I've had 3 or 4 conversations like that, and and the facial expression I'm getting is the same expression I got from David Irving when he would go, when I would say, but look at what you said. You made that Chappaquiddick joke. And he goes, oh, it was only a joke. And I'm going, it's only funny if you accept your premise. That can't, and I got the same response.
Let's fast forward along with to this time where in which we are now. You've put most of this behind you and become a regular writer. No, not so much. I mean,
Well, yeah, I mean,
you moved into science
I've
fiction.
become much more of a commentator. I did not expect that. That was unexpected. I always thought, I
How
mean, I used to before Brexit, before 2016, actually, if I was in the pages of a national newspaper in either the UK or Australia, it was because I was writing a book review. I wrote reviews of other people's books,
how
usually
okay,
fiction.
so how did going to law school and becoming a lawyer fit into this career path? Because now,
All right, okay, I should explain the way the Aussie system works. Uh, there's only one Australian university, and it did this relatively recently, the University of Melbourne, that has the US style structure of a law degree. That is where you do something else as an undergraduate, then go to law school, and tend to be quite a lot older, like mid late 20s, early 30s. They often are before they start practicing law. The Australian system is not like that. And no law school in Australia was when I started as an undergraduate in 1990. You do a qualification that's known as arts with a slash and law, or science with a slash and law, or commerce with a slash and a law. Nearly always people do arts with a forward slash and law. People who do accountancy or economics have, particularly the accountants, and have given themselves a very hard job, because it's another whole professional qualification. And you study them at the same time, and you start at 17 or 18. Australian universities, you start quite young. I was 17 when I started university. And you're admitted to the university. You have to meet the cutoff, the academic cutoff for both law and arts. Even though you'll be taught in the same university, the sharp distinction between different universities that you see in the United States or the UK with the Russell Group and the Ivies, or particularly Oxford and Cambridge. In Australia, there's a bit of that. There's the Group of 8. There's the sandstone universities that were founded in the late 19th century. And the eldest, they're over 100 years old. There's a bit of that, but within those universities, there's much more intense competition based on the course you study. So you need many more points to get into medicine, law, engineering, pharmacy. Those are the prestige qualifications than you do for arts. So you go in to do arts and law, and the whole point of the arts qualification was so you're not a dreadful bore, highly educated person who is also not pig ignorant and actually knows who Charles Dickens is. That was the original logic behind it.
Sure.
What I did was I started an arts law qualification. And my first novel actually came out while I was still an undergraduate. I hadn't even finished the arts qualification, let alone do very many law subjects. So I actually dropped my law course in the 90s. I thought I was going to be a full-time writer. That didn't happen, even though I did do quite a bit of writing and so on and so forth. I worked some very odd jobs. I worked as an archaeologist for a while. I was an interpreter for a while in the Home Office. I did all sorts of unusual, non-legally related jobs.
What languages?
Italian.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I've lived in Italy, so and it was because it was during the Balkan crisis, and nobody spoke Albanian. Like I think they worked out in the whole of Britain there were about 3 people who spoke Albanian, but nearly all the refugees spoke Italian. So they were just desperately hunting for people.
Well,
with
Albanians
the
are pass themselves off as Italians all the time.
And it's because of Rai. It's Rai Uno, Rai Due, and Rai Tre, the Italian television, all comes over the Adriatic, and they all watch it, and you can actually learn Italian off Italian pre-Berlusconi Italian television. You could certainly learn Italian off of it.
Interesting.
It was just the nature of the way Rai has worked historically in Italy. And so I did all sorts of odd jobs like that. But then I realized, well, I hadn't had another idea for a book. I'd started to write one, and it was a disastrous piece of crap. I finished up throwing it all away. It was just awful. I knew when I was writing bad stuff. And so I thought, well, look, I need to get a useful job of work and that pays decently and that I suspect I'll be good at because I put words together well. So I went back and finished the law degree that I hadn't finished. And that's what I did. I then just worked as a lawyer either in Australia or over here. And it did what it says on the tin. It allowed me to pursue different things and so on and so forth. And it also meant and this is to go back to the first book, it also meant, from my point of view, the whole cancellation thing just seemed to have disappeared. I was just working ordinary, normal jobs as a lawyer in various countries. I got a scholarship to go to Oxford to do graduate qualifications, the famous Oxford BCL. There were no issues with that. And I thought, right, this is my future. I wrote one book and I don't have any more good ideas. I'll just be an attorney for the rest of my life, solicitor, barrister in the UK. I then, however, took a job up in Scotland, and Scottish law is different from English law, really quite dramatically different. It's got a lot more Roman law. It's a different legal system. It's procedurally quite similar, but the substantive law is quite different.
Really?
And I couldn't do Scottish work for the very simple and basic reason that I did not know how to do it. So I had to do certain subjects.
Well, this is how we know you're not an American lawyer, because people are doing all kinds of, people do things they don't know how to do all the time. That's what the entirety of Twitter is, people practicing law, having no idea what they're talking about.
Practicing a law without a license, or however you put it in America. Yeah, it's without a practicing certificate over here.
Unauthorized practice of law.
Yeah, and it's
so you're in Scotland.
And so
what were you doing there? Why'd you go in the first place?
There was just a very, very good job that I thought I would be very good at after I finished at Oxford. So I applied for it and I got it. And that law firms like people who went to Oxford Law School and got good marks there. They think they might be pretty clever, and so they hire them. And but there were certain things I had to do at the University of Edinburgh, certain subjects that were Scottish law, like property law and family law. It's more like Roman law, so it's very different. And I had to do a year-long subject in civil law, which is the traditional, not only the law of the Roman Empire, but the history of Roman law and how it became so important both in Scotland and on the continent. And that all seemed by the by. It was very interesting and enjoyable, and I thought that was good, and so on and so forth.
And you're broadening your ability to practice law, so you're going to be
and all of that,
even
and
more
so
of a lawyer.
And so forth. I then had to, though, be formally admitted in Scotland because it's a different jurisdiction. I had to go through an admissions process where you lodge your papers with your academic transcript and show that you haven't paid 1 million speeding fines recently, and all of the things that they do for lawyers. And I didn't have very much in Scotland, so I sent them England and Wales as well because I'd been down in a university and living in Oxford and all of that kind of thing. And I had formal objections made to my admission in Scotland from the people who'd had a problem with my book in 1995. They had made no attempt to cause me grief in England and Wales some years earlier, or to stop me going to Oxford, or so on and so forth. This was in 2012. At the time, because I had to get legal advice to get this sorted, at the time I thought, it's, oh my God, it's the Jewish lobby back for another bite. And technically, that was true, but only technically, because by 2012, everybody had started to decide that a completely appropriate way to respond to someone who said things that they didn't like, either in a book or on the telly or whatever, was to try to get them sacked, to get them disbarred, to get them struck off, whatever the expression is used in your jurisdiction for lawyers and for doctors. I know it varies.
Cancel.
And so it went into abeyance. There was a sincere attempt on me in 1995 that didn't work. My book was never out of print. It continued to sell. It's provided me with a very good income, including in lean periods over the years. So I can't complain. That was another thing. It was quite difficult to cancel people in the 90s because, particularly just with words, you could cancel them if you physically threatened them, like Salman Rushdie. But if you just did it with words, you tended to just make the person's book into, or film or whatever it was, into a
And there was no
bestseller.
social
You
media.
created this, yeah, you created a Streisand effect, basically. Whereas now, everybody has decided that it's completely fine to cancel people. And we use this word cancel, which didn't used to exist. I first wrote about this phenomenon in 2015, and I did not use the word cancelled because no one had used it, I don't think, at that point. And it has become completely standard. Everybody is doing it. It is very, very hard in the United States now, and I will say this with complete honesty, to tell Jewish people and conservatives who finally got a lever that they can pull on these appalling universities and the nonsense that they've produced and so on and so forth, and the bigotry and the sectarianism and so on and so forth. They're now pulling the same lever because they found that it works. And I wrote a piece for my Substack, which was featured on the front page of Substack's website, Mutually Assured Cancellation. But it's very, very hard to tell people who've been on the receiving end of it for a very long time to not do it. And this is where I
In
go
other
to
words, to
Americans
not
and go,
do it,
you are the country with a culture of free speech.
to
Bring
not
it
do it
back.
back, to not do it back. In other words, when given the opportunity to do it to those who have done it to them, it's hard to tell people, wait,
No.
stop, stand on principle.
Yes, it's very hard to get people to be principled. It's very hard, you know,
So,
like,
okay, so what happened in the Scottish situation? You were not able.
well, no, I was admitted to practice and so on and so forth, but I had to engage legal representation. I had to put together, formal submissions, that I wasn't an anti-Semite, that I wasn't a this, I wasn't a that, and so on and so forth. I had to go through all of the process. It was very unpleasant. And it was only resolved fully the day before I had to front up in the Court of Session to have my admission moved by the firm that I was working for. So yes, it was very, very stressful and unpleasant. I was sitting there thinking that it was finally resolved the day before, and I was just, and I can't even remember if I slept properly that night or that kind of thing. But it was just, this is 2012. My book won the Miles Franklin Award that you were annoyed about in 1995. It's time to put it aside. But the point is, by 2012, we're into that period that Jonathan Haidt is talking about, where the world is getting into this madness where everybody decides that this is an entirely appropriate way to behave towards someone who you disagree with.
I guess, now that I think about it, in a world where everybody can everybody has access to a box in Hyde Park. We can't rely on gatekeepers anymore to shut
Mm.
people out. So we have to crowdsource shutting people out. And that's really what they're doing.
And it's producing a system of shunning. That's all I can. It's a type of
Oh,
shunning
100%.
almost.
100%.
And where they can't shun, where the shunning doesn't work. And I'm an example of someone where the shunning didn't work. What happens is you're just siloed. And I wrote about this, and Andrew Doyle has used my argument in one of his books. Um, and what that means is you finish up being in a press environment that might be quite lively and expansive, and many people read your stuff, but they're all people who are either agree with you or they're adjacent to you politically.
Yep, 100%.
And so
You
in
can,
2015, I was safely able to write a piece for The Guardian, because that's where it appeared, on what became cancel culture. It was for The Guardian, me, in 2015.
impossible.
Whereas now, the idea of me appearing in The Guardian is just completely fanciful. And they'll be very honest with you if you write to them. You know, this used to be a newspaper that was quite good at grabbing people from the other side of the aisle. And I was one of many, many writers that it did this to. You write to them now and you go, I would like to pitch you a piece on X, and you summarize a standard freelance writer's pitch. They'll quite often just write back and say, oh no, we don't publish conservatives.
Yeah, 100%.
And the thing is, it's starting to now happen on the other side. And that's called the silo effect. That's
Absolutely.
what I coined. Imagine two grain silos looking at each other across a street and in the middle of one of
Did
the
you
grain
seriously? Are
states.
you taking? Is it your testimony sitting here today? I hate that. I hate sitting here today.
Yeah.
Is it
Yeah.
that you coined the term the silo effect? Is that what you're saying, Helen?
I'm not sure.
Oh,
I've certainly described it. I don't know if I
I'd love to know
coined
that.
it, but I described it
That's what it
in a
is, though.
way
You're
that
100%
that
right.
Andrew Doyle then used it, the silo effect. And it's a specific thing whereby you start writing for the Daily Mail and you stop writing for the Guardian. And as far as the readers of the Guardian are concerned, you have simply disappeared. This is what happened to Suzanne Moore.
And who's Suzanne Moore?
A very, very fine left-leaning feminist writer for The Guardian, very funny, mainly, for many, many years, and happens to be gender critical on Team J.K. Rowling, and so that was the end of her, and they shoved her out of the newspaper. She had a petition around the office that basically every other journalist signed, except for her in the newsroom.
Well, speaking of Bolsheviks, right? Here's another angle on it. I can't tell you how many, and the reason is I haven't counted, it's not a gazillion, but there are numerous people who are either apolitical or people of the left who I have asked to come on this show. And I'm not a big platform. It's a niche. It's a niche.
Yeah.
And they won't do it because you're political and you're conservative, and there's no upside for me. There might be an upside for you, Ron. Yeah, I think there would be, because I think my audience would like to meet you and like to hear you and like to hear. I cannot get a discussion going with anyone who isn't already in my silo with me. So I can find interesting people like
Yes.
you who've had interesting experiences and, who see things in a unique way, but you can't have the conversation, therefore you became a science fiction writer.
Well, what I did was I finally got a good idea.
For a book.
So I did the thing, and that's why, as I admit, it took 13 years to write these two books. That's book one and book two.
Yes.
And as you can see, they're quite tasty and
meaty.
chunky.
Yeah.
Meaty.
And they were mentioned. I thought of you as a lawyer and commentator. And then I'm listening, as one does, to the little platoon who I've had on the show, and who's worth having on your show just for that voice. He's great.
Lovely speaking
but
voice.
Also really, really well informed and well educated, sophisticated thinker. And he mentions your books, and I said, Helen Dale. I mean, not the most obscure name in the world, but is that my friend from Twitter, Helen Dale? Darn if it isn't you. So tell us a little bit about those and how that sort of fits, which I think it does with the rest of this conversation.
Well, basically, I knew all this stuff about legal systems, and I practiced in different legal systems. And it's always been a personal bugbear of mine when you read works of science fiction by pretty good writers who are very good at conceiving technology and society and so on, but they'll have incredibly primitive legal systems. So you'll still have trial by battle or something like that in there. And I just thought, right, I'd like to do science fiction with like science fiction lawyers. And so that means, and because I'm a lawyer and I've practiced in all these odd places and done all this odd sort of law, it will be good law. It will be a real legal system, but it won't be identifiably one or that exists anywhere in the world. I will make it up. And so that was the starting point.
Oh, that's interesting. So in other words,
Yes.
that was, but so that isn't necessarily but it's science fiction because you're positing a world that's not our world.
What I will do is I don't write these. I am terrible at writing blurbs, and so I have never written one. Either for myself or any other writer. However, my editor, my publisher, is very good. So I will read Matthew's blurb and it will put your readers in the picture.
Okay.
784 Ab Urbe Condita, 31 AD. Jerusalem sits uneasily in a Roman Empire that has seen an industrial revolution and now has cable news and flying machines, and rights and morals that are strange and repellent to the native people of Judea. A charismatic young leader is arrested after a riot in the temple. He seems to be a man of peace, but among his followers are zealots and dagger men sworn to drive the Romans from the Holy Land. As the city spirals into violence, the stage is set for a legal case that will shape the future, the trial of Yeshua ben Yusuf. Intricately imagined and ferociously executed, Kingdom of the Wicked is a stunning alternative history and a story for our time. So what I've done is a version of Philip K. Dick, speculative fiction, alternative history, alternate history, they sometimes insist on it, where you go down a different timeline. But this time, with the innovative thing, the conceit that I used, the high concept that my agent calls this kind of thinking high concept. Thank you, Matthew Hamilton. I didn't know this, but that's high concept apparently when he was selling these. So I've learned this. And the conceit is that I don't change the actual timeline of what actually happened. You know, Tiberius is still the emperor, Pontius Pilate is still the prefect.
You just change the details.
Governor. What I've done is I have changed the arc of historical progress or historical narrative based on a point of departure where Archimedes is not killed at the Battle of Syracuse and he becomes the Romans' DARPA guy. And so I set this all up with a fair degree of intricacy to make, and then I just let it run. And so it's kind of like letting an experiment run and just seeing what happens. I worked out then once I had the legal background, was thought, what made these two cultures so different? Why didn't they get on? And they didn't get on in ways that are very familiar to modern people, but were very unusual to people in the ancient world. Yeah, so that kind of thing. So I had to present all of that sort of conflict with Islamism, for example, as something new.
Right.
People had not seen it yet. Pagans in Europe, and that word we use is not the word they use to describe themselves. They followed the right of this or the right of that or whatever.
They considered themselves humanity. I mean, yeah. the knock on Christianity was that they were haters of humanity.
Yes.
Here we are being regular. Here we are just being people. And I've got a problem. I've got a problem with crops, so I'm going to go to the crop god. Why wouldn't I do that? Why wouldn't I sacrifice to the god of healing when my child is sick? Like, why do you hate me for that? One God. So what?
And you get, and the thing is, you get Romans responding like that, and you do also get Romans and Jews trying to talk to each other, trying to bridge this huge, because it's not just an intellectual or theological divide, it's also a moral divide. You finish up with very, very different approaches to human morality. And in the modern world, you would say until relatively recently, the Jews won some of those arguments, but the Romans won others. You know, the Romans were the ones that made everybody that they conquered monogamous. No, you're not going to have more than one wife. You know, that kind of, and of course, what did that do? It passed into Christianity. And you think, Romans,
Eventually.
monogamy, didn't they bang like a dunny door and a gale? You know, this kind of thing. But of course, it was serial monogamy. They were all busily getting divorced all the time. And so I just had these good ideas for books, and I was writing them at home in the evening, doing the thing. And that's why I've only written 3 novels, because I worked a normal job for years and years that has long hours. And they came out in book 1 came out in 2017, and then book 2 in 2018. My publisher did think for a while of putting them in just in one, but no, it's better when you got books that are, oh goodness, nearly 500 pages long. It needs to be a separate book for each. But I wanted to give people Roman morality, and you know, they're not just like us, and we're not like them. And it's not just that the odd end, the cruel entertainment and stuff that everybody knows about from watching Gladiator. It's just they didn't think people were equal. That's probably the first big thing. So I had to introduce lawyers who are talking about things that make sense to other lawyers in the first 20 pages, but they're also talking about, oh, you're a citizen, so you get a jury. No, you're a non-citizen, you don't get a jury as of right, you have to pay for the jurors to sit, which was a distinction that the Romans had. That kind of thing, which just makes modern people go, but by the same token, they're talking about legal concepts that will make sense to any lawyer, because the Romans were the other great lawgiver civilization. So they've got tort, which they call delict, and they've got libel, which they call injuria. They've got all of the things. They've got the system of contracts that would make perfect sense to modern people. They've even got the concept of hire purchase. It works exactly the same way that hire purchase does in our society. Bailment, all of these things that are completely a lawyer's bread and butter. How to draft a will. You see them applied in slightly different areas, like marriage was a contract to the Romans, so you have your notary draft up a contract.
And
that kind of thing.
And
so
these have obviously done pretty well, because you've been able to.
they've done really well, although it did help, I have to say. I was worried they would only sell like maybe 5,000 copies each or something, and that would just be it. But then they got a very positive review in one of the British papers, the Financial Times. And the same person who wrote that review is an economist called Mark Koyama. And he actually wrote a long version of the review that had all this incredibly detailed economic analysis in it that was amazingly good on his private Medium blog. And anyway, first of all, the short version from the newspaper, Tim Harford, the economist in the UK, tweeted it with his share token, and his tweet went viral. Thousands of retweets, and people were interested. The review was very positive and charming, and lots of people bought the book on the basis of that. Then the long form of the review by this economist, this Professor Mark Koyama, used to be at Oxford, he's at George Mason University now. It was featured, probably because it was so detailed, on Tyler Cowen's Marginal Revolution. And Tyler Cowen said, oh, I've started reading this book, it's really excellent. And it just proceeded to just fly off the shelves.
Terrific.
So I was very, very lucky.
And did the cancellation crowd not even bother?
No, I didn't have. I had one unpleasant incident in 2018 at the classics department. Obviously, classics, ancient world. Yeah, so I went to go and give a talk to people in the classics department, and they were given weird threats about protesters and would turn up and I would be picketed. And this was in 2018. And anyway, the university, to its credit, in 2018, the universities hadn't gone under, just said, oh, we will be in contact with Victoria Police. There will be a police officer on the door. And there was a police officer on the door. And it was all very fine. And you know how many protesters turned up? And she was a very sad protester who was very polite. One. one protester. And here's me getting up there talking about classics and answering questions on, the social policies of the Emperor Augustus, who was trying to reduce the divorce rates, for example, in the Roman world, and he tried to pass laws to stop that and reduce it. And it was interesting because he didn't have a problem with the idea of divorce, so the approach is very different from the modern one.
It's
so that kind of thing. So I'd be talking about stuff like that.
So you blew past it. You seem to you broke
Yeah,
the back of the.
although I do wonder, there are a number of things that I blew past a cancellation. One, it became clear to me with the controversy over the first book, because I was still in a university at the time and I did have contact with a lot more people on the political left. It became clear to me that the Jews were rapidly running out of friends on the left. And they thought that these various left-wing organizations or lefty people, and I'm not talking about Palestine here, Palestine, not a word. No one's talking about Palestine. This is a non-issue. And in any case, was nothing to do with my controversy, never came up at all. But it was pretty clear.
So here, when you say the Jews, you mean the people who purport to speak in the name of the Jews. In other words,
yeah, I would have said activists
right.
at this point, but the problem is it extended very quickly over the next 10 or 15 years beyond activists to just anybody who is Jewish, this collapsing of Zionism and Israeli into Jew, and it all just becomes this general blob.
Yeah.
That thing that's happened in the last probably two years, but certainly since October 7th, it's definitely happened. So what I was sort of thinking was, I thought, you kind of don't have friends here. You think these people are your friends, but they're not really your friends, but you don't like me,
this
so
is you
I won't say anything.
You speaking to the Jews.
Or about people I noticed who were Jewish, who were very strongly on the political left.
Right.
So very, very strongly pro-multicultural policy, very, very pro high rates of immigration, including from parts of the Islamic world that it's very few have actually been able to get into Australia because of the way the country's immigration system works, but a few did. So very, very woke, what we would call woke now.
Right.
And the thing is, I got the very strong impression, and this is an Australian thing that I've written about. The first group I noticed who started to generalize in a pretty unpleasant way about Jewish people, and in a way that modern people now would recognize, because they were running the decolonization line, and they would do it about Australia, settler colonial state, and they would do it about Israel, settler colonial state. And they tended to be the very, very small number of Australian Aborigines who were starting to get into universities in that period. And I've written about this for Law and Liberty, this rhetoric. And I noticed it, the decolonization rhetoric. Another friend of mine, she said she was involved in land rights activism, and the thing is, her case is unusual because she has both Aboriginal and Jewish ancestry, so she was seeing it from Australia is full of people like this. It's just it is the most ethnically diverse country on earth, per head of population, so it's full of people like Katie. And so she was seeing this from both sides, and it was, no, this is really nasty. And the same rhetoric about Australia Day as Invasion Day, and it's not legitimate, and covering statues of Captain Cook with red paint, or Arthur Phillip, who was the First Fleet, Captain Arthur Phillip, who led the First Fleet, all of this kind of thing. And the same language was used. And I remember the first time I encountered Jewish people, and this is the problem with thou shalt not compare thinking. They were very shocked by this kind of rhetoric. And they would go, oh, they're saying that Israel shouldn't exist. And I'm going, have you not noticed what Aborigines say every single Australia Day on social media and elsewhere? They say that Australia shouldn't exist. And they say it in exactly the same way. And they have been saying it for 20 years.
And maybe that should bother you too. Maybe that should bother you too. Because you live in Australia. You live in Australia, in fact. You don't live in Israel.
Oh, No, and I started to, and it wasn't just me. A lot of people started to say, "Well, hang on, you might want to look at the people who look at the world in this way and see every single country that's got white people in it that had an indigenous population there beforehand as oppressive and colonized and so on and so forth." And 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 it's such a level of blindness that you can't even raise historic empires. You can't talk about the Mughals. You can't talk about the Ottomans. You can't talk about the Zulu. You can't talk about, all these major, major civilizations that were also empires that were not white people. And the blindness is just total.
Helen, thank you for shining some light into the dark. We,
Read my books, they're more fun than me
I
yapping on.
think we're going to have to do that. And I'm so glad that Benjamin brought us together in this way, because I'd really long overdue for us to hang out. And I hope
Yeah.
that we can do it again in some form, or even in this form again. Great conversation. And everyone,
Good luck with all your things,
thank
and
you.
just, yeah,
Helen
even if
is,
it's only lawyers watching it.
no, no, it's lawyers don't, if lawyers are watching it, they're not admitting it. Actually, a lot of Jews watch it. And it's important for, I mean, and I think the people who, anyone who watches ColemanNation or listens to ColemanNation knows, criticizing Jews or even criticizing the Jews doesn't make you an anti-Semite. If it did, I'd be the biggest anti-Semite you ever heard of.
Oh, yeah. Well, I know what
Second
they
to
would call you,
Moses.
and I did see this directed at Jewish people. I have seen this, and it's a horrible thing. They call them self-hating Jews, and the thing is, I don't know where that came from for you, for Jewish people, but I know where it came. I'm gay, and one of the things that gets directed at homosexuals who are right-leaning and has been for years, as in I can remember it being said to me in the 90s when I was actually outed as part of the controversy over my first book. I was a self-hating lesbian or a self-hating homosexual. I heard that in the 90s, and it is just the most awful thing to say.
And it's right. So the whole thing with the self-hating Jew. Well, I get that all the time because I'm a
Yeah.
capo. See, I'm a because I'm a conservative and I support Donald Trump. And like, as opposed to what? Like you said, take a look at the left.
Mm.
These people are literally genocidally inclined. But we anticipate.
I mean, I realize the history of the Jews, of Jewish people in America is very different from the UK, because Jews in the UK are nearly all Tory. Like something, the figures in the last 2019 was like 92%, and it'll probably be more now, since
Interesting.
even though,
Oh,
yeah. So the UK really different. Australia more like the US. There are quite a significant number of Jews who are really quite left. And they're having that same horrible post October 7th wake up call, including some who have worked with Aboriginal organisations and have suddenly discovered that they're on the outer around the water cooler. And like, oh, yeah, there's been some awful stuff. But the UK is quite different.
Helen, you're a polymath of the word. Great talking to you. Let's stay in touch.